All right, folks, welcome to the Strong for Life podcast. I'm really excited to share today's guest. Dave was on a few weeks back, maybe about 6 weeks ago, talking about gut health. But today we're going to do a special masterclass on the impact of gut health on emotional health, on illnesses such as schizophrenia or anxiety. This really hits home for me because my mother has struggled with schizophrenia for over 30 years, and there's quite a strong correlation in my family history. So yeah, just really excited to hear all of the correlations that your gut could have on illnesses like this. So Dave, thanks for jumping on, mate, and sharing your knowledge.
Yeah, thanks for having me back, and I look forward to obviously talking about a topic that is obviously quite it's quite personal for you, and obviously we've chosen to probably be a little bit more direct here, okay, where we're obviously going to talk about a particular mental health complication, obviously like being schizophrenia, but I might actually talk about even the links to other mental health issues and mental health symptoms with some of the things I'm going to talk about as well. But obviously, there's going to be a high concentration on schizophrenia directly. I mean, one thing, before we jump into it, that I want to say that I think a lot of people miss, because we were talking about this, just before we jumped on, where I think when people do have these mental health symptoms and they have these mental health disorders, that the major approach that they're going to use to try to rectify this, okay, yes, is going to be down like, pharmaceuticals and medications, but also I guess they're led to believe that really the culprits behind this has maybe been childhood traumas and, a lot of the stresses in their life, and maybe just chronic stress, and so it's really going to come down to that you need to see a psychiatrist. And I'm not taking away from any of these things, okay? But then obviously what we're saying is that really that the sole reason that they have that issue is because they have these issues in their brain. And so what I'm here to talk about is the connection with these types of mental health complications and the gut. And obviously a lot of people call the gut like the second brain, like the mini brain. I might push back on that a little bit, and I might actually say that the gut is like the first brain. Because even if we look at it from a neurochemical and neurotransmitter perspective, and some of the major neurotransmitters, okay, so I'm calling them like neurochemicals, that people might have heard of before, okay, would be things like serotonin and dopamine and maybe GABA, which is gamma-aminobutyric acid, and acetylcholine. But there's like 122 neurotransmitters. Don't worry, I'm not going to bore people to tears talking about all 122 neurotransmitters, yeah, okay? But when I say to people, like, where do you think neurotransmitters and neurochemicals come from, okay? And the initial response is always going to be what? Well, they come from your brain. But the building blocks that you ultimately need for things like hormones as well, okay, but neurochemicals and neurotransmitters ultimately comes from food, like the building blocks that you need for you actually need for it, okay? But the area that has to assimilate that food so that you actually have the building blocks that you require for those neurochemicals and neurotransmitters is actually the gut. Okay, and that's going to be the microbiome. So even if we're talking about some of these neurotransmitters, just for example, like dopamine, we're going to come back to that because dopamine is very relevant to schizophrenia. Because most of the time they're just going to say it's a dopamine issue, and let's park that for 2 seconds, and we'll come back to that. Yeah, okay. But you actually do need certain types of bacterial strains to actually help with things like dopamine and catecholamines like norepinephrine, epinephrine. If people don't know what I'm talking about there, okay, epinephrine being like adrenaline. I think people have heard of adrenaline before, noradrenaline. And people don't know, okay, there's certain types of bacterial strains like bacillus strains, and there's all these different types of bacillus strains like Bacillus coagulans, Bacillus subtilis, but you need them to actually help with things like dopamine.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, even acetylcholine, which is excitatory in the brain, inhibitory in the cardiovascular system. It's a very unique neurotransmitter. Okay, acetylcholine sort of governs the vagus nerve. Okay, so really important for like gut motility, transit time of food. Now, a bacterial strain that you actually need for acetylcholine, well, the broad group is lactobacillus, which I think everyone might have heard of before. Like, you've seen like probiotic ads before, where the little bacteria is like jumping up and down and celebrating. Okay, the two major bacteria they're generally talking about is like bifidobacterium and lactobacillus, but there's 190 different strains of lactobacillus. And one of the major lactobacillus strains that you need for acetylcholine is Lactobacillus plantarum. And I'm just using them as like a bit of an example. So my point is, even like, when it comes to the production of like dopamine, the major area that people are going to focus on is going to be the brain, isn't it? Okay, and they're going to say it's produced mainly in three parts of the brain, and I'm once again, I'm not disputing that at all. Okay, so they're going to say the most important parts of the brain: substantia nigra, that's where you produce dopamine. You got the VTA, it's called the ventral tegmental area of the brain. Okay, and then you got the hypothalamus, which I think most people have probably heard of the hypothalamus.
Hypothalamus,
okay?
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, but that's what they're going to say. They're going to say, well, that's where you're producing dopamine. Well, do you know that you actually produce dopamine within the enteric nervous system? So just to elaborate on that, okay, the enteric nervous system is a nervous system that exists between the gut and the brain. So we're talking about like, because the gut is basically the central hub of all accesses in the body. You would think it's the brain, okay, but more than not, it's the gut, okay? So you've got like the gut to skin axis. You've got the gut to reproductive organ axis. You've got the gut to lung axis. You got the gut to kidney axis. You got the gut to liver axis. You got the bile acid to gut microbiome axis. Okay, you got the enteric, and I just can keep on going. Does that make sense? Okay, so the enteric nervous system, okay, is the nervous system that exists between the gut and the brain, and so within the enteric nervous system, that stretches from like parts of the brain like the cerebellum to the base of the abdomen. Okay, and within that you've got like all these different neurons. Okay, and you also produce a certain amount of like neurotransmitters. So for example, you've probably heard this before, where roughly, and I'm saying roughly, about 5% of your serotonin is actually produced in the brain, okay? But anywhere between about 80 to 95% of your serotonin is actually produced within the gut, okay? And you need gut bacteria for that. And you need a whole heap of gut bacteria, okay? So you need things like Clostridium and Clostridium, Streptococcus strains, Enterococcus. So your microbiome plays such a key role, and even other bacterial strains like Lactobacillus, okay, can be really important around like serotonin as well, okay. So, but a lot of people don't realize that. That's my point, yeah, okay. But up to about 50% of your dopamine is actually produced within the enteric nervous system. So it's up to about 50%. I'm saying roughly. I'm not saying that's definitive. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. Because you can read research and literature, and it can vary. So it's not, I'm not saying 50% is definitive. Yeah, okay. But my point is, if about 50% is in your brain and 50% is within your enteric nervous system and within the gut, why aren't we told to rectify what's going on in the gut to fix what is dopamine related issues? And that would obviously relate to what we're talking about in relation to schizophrenia.
Okay, yeah, because I guess just to jump in, Dave, like I guess the big thing we want to get across on this episode for people is to show them that there are other things to look at that can help you from an overall health standpoint, but also from a mental health standpoint. And as Dave was saying, like if 50% of this stuff is happening in your gut, if your gut is all dysfunctional and you've never even looked at it, then this could be a huge area that you could use to heal and to improve your health, your symptoms physically and psychologically.
Yeah, well, the big thing with that, Connor, is that like 50% is like if you're trying to rectify a particular mental health complication or mental health symptom, 50% is a big piece of the jigsaw puzzle to miss out on.
Yeah,
it's huge. Okay, so my thing is, I'm not taking away, once again, I'm not a psychiatrist. Yeah, okay, and it's not me saying that looking into that realms is not important. You should be looking into, childhood traumas and psychological stress, and like definitely you should be dealing with that as well, because they could be contributors. But a big contributor could be what's going on in the gut, and it could be like a big piece that you're just completely missing, couldn't it?
Yeah, one thing as well that like it's so obvious once I like thought about it, but I never really thought about it. This was like years after I came across you in Fifth Element Wellness, and my friend Tara, I think she actually went to Fifth Element Wellness as well and did the apprenticeship with you guys. But she had a baby, and we were just kind of talking about the birth and everything. And the child was born, but like the baby, everything happens with the it's surviving through the abdomen, like into the gut. So like the oxygen, the food, everything is happening through there as a child or as a baby in the womb. So you can see like that's where you're coming from a life form standpoint. And I was like, oh, that makes so much sense now why the gut is like so important, because that's how you've survived within the womb.
Yeah, well, and even
So
if you
yeah.
look at it, if you go a step further than that, and I won't go too far down this rabbit hole because I don't want to open up a completely different can of worms. Yeah, okay. But the microbiome fully develop, I'm talking about within a toddler, okay, within the first 1,000 days of their life. Okay, and so where do you think the toddler, where do you think the baby also gets that microbiome balance from? Well, initially it's going to be the baby passing through the vaginal wall.
Hmm.
But a lot of time, females are choosing to have C-sections, okay, and so they're not doing like vaginal swabbing and all that type of stuff, yeah, okay. So and also you actually do have females have a lot of microbiome within the breast tissue. Hence why there can be a link to even things like breast cancer with like a higher abundance of like negative gram bacteria and LPS issues. Okay, but there's a high amount of microbiome within the breast tissue, and that makes sense because of like breast milk. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's going to have an influence on that as well, like even on skin to skin contact. Okay, what they're getting exposed to in the environment. Okay, this is really essential for the development of the microbiome. Now, in saying that, okay, even if the female didn't have a C-section, they had like a standard regular birth, okay, and they passed through the vaginal wall, people perceive that the baby just received the perfect microbiome balance. But that was really dependent on the mother having good microbiome balance to start off with.
Mm.
And if the mother had like, a higher abundance of more pathogenic strains of like bacteria, and that could include more pathogenic strains or more virulent forms of like candida and yeast, well, then the baby would actually receive more pathogenic or more virulent forms of candida and yeast. And that's where that could start to pose a bit of a problem, okay, for even things like neurological development and all that type of stuff. Yeah, so
Mm.
yeah, that's just another point that I wanted to get across. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's go to schizophrenia.
Yep.
There's two kind of sections that you're going to focus on to
Two,
give a
two,
bit of.
two major sections that I want to focus
Yep.
on. Yeah. Okay.
And
So
then we can give people some like actionable, okay, this is going to help reinforce or help you from an emotional standpoint or a gut health standpoint linked to your emotional health. We can kind of go there after you give this background, okay?
yeah. So let's start with one that where I'm going to say that this is not necessarily like a real direct link. Yeah. Okay. But like this complication, this gut issue, would definitely create some micronutrient deficiencies that could create the issues from a neurological standpoint that would be linked to like schizophrenia. And that's actually to do with, let's focus on the micronutrient first, okay, that I'm talking about, which is actually B3. So for people who don't know what B3 is, okay, it's niacin and has a niacin deficiency. Has it actually been linked to schizophrenia? Well, you can actually find some literature on this where niacin deficiency could lead to schizophrenic symptoms. And the interesting thing around this, okay, because remember I said that a lot of people talk about the link between like dopamine issues and schizophrenia. And so where this can get a little bit murky is where it could be actually like too much dopamine or it could be like too little. So both of those scenarios could cause like delusions and hallucinations, and that's been caused by dopamine problems. Now, the thing with what I'm going to talk about, which is actually like candida and yeast, that's what I'm going to talk about. And I don't want to demonize candida and yeast. And I think we might have actually touched on this slightly in the previous podcast that we actually did. Okay, so maybe people can go back and listen to that. Because candida and yeast is not the devil. Okay, it's part of a normal ecology. It is meant to be there. There's about 150 different strains of candida and yeast. So it's commensal within your sinus passages, commensal within the nasal secretions. You've got about 80 different strains on your skin, but you've got two major groups of like candida and yeast. So one is the commensal forms of like candida albicans and the other strains, and the commensal forms do actually help with like aspects around your immune system, nutrient assimilation, nutrient absorption. These are good things, so let's not demonize it. But what can happen is the more commensal forms of candida can turn into their more virulent forms. And when they're in the more virulent forms, that's where they become more problematic. And so the virulent forms of Candida, that's the ones that have actually been linked to systemic issues. Okay, and so that would include things like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which I think some people would have heard of that for sure. Okay, or like, liver disease, fatty liver.
Can you explain that to people?
In layman's terms, okay. Because a lot of people are going to perceive, okay, when they've got like this overburdening of the liver, okay, that it's probably going to be as a result of like drinking too much alcohol. And once again, I'm not taking away from those aspects, okay, but you've actually got the gut to liver axis. And we actually did speak about this in a podcast, okay? You've got this really unique epithelium or mucosal cell in your gut lining, okay? They're called Paneth cells, and we're actually probably going to come back to that. They're actually only located in your small intestine, and they're located right at the base of the intestinal crypt. And the role of the Paneth cells in a nutshell is to release AMPs. They're called, the AMP stands for antimicrobial peptides. And those antimicrobial peptides, what they do, and there's a whole heap of them, they prevent bacterial translocation from your gut lining to other organs in the body. And that would include like your liver, your spleen, your pancreas, okay? But also, so you don't get like these metabolites and these byproducts coming from the bacteria, even overburdening your brain. Now, if you have this damage to the Paneth cells and compromisation and decrease in the antimicrobial peptides, you get more bacterial translocation from the gut to the liver. Okay, and then that would be classified. So the metabolites and the byproducts, that could actually lead to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, because alcohol and lifestyle factors aren't the major contributor in that instance. Does that make sense? Okay, so you're having a raise in like liver enzymes, and some of those liver enzymes would be like AST, aspartate aminotransferase, and ALT, and alanine aminotransferase, and GGT, gamma glutamyl transferase. So you get this massive raise in like these liver enzymes. So there's like that overburdening of the liver. Yeah. That's me trying to dumb it down as much as I can.
Okay. Candida and yeast.
Yeah, and so that could that also could lead to other systemic diseases, would be even things like cancers. Okay. So the thing with Candida and yeast, it can expel up to about 80 different toxins in your system. It's a lot. Now, I'm not going to talk about every single toxin, okay? But there is two that I really want to focus on here, okay? They're the most relevant, okay? And I don't know if you've ever heard of these before, okay? One is acetaldehyde.
No.
So acetaldehyde is a neurotoxin. That's me really dumbing it down. So what does that mean, okay? Well, it can potentially damage your brain cells. Now, also, acetaldehyde is a known carcinogen, okay? Which basically means that it is linked to cancer as well, for people who don't know what that means, yeah, okay? So, and the other one is ethanol. Now, I think most people might have heard of ethanol before, yeah, okay? Because like ethanol, the way to look at it, you drink alcohol gets converted to ethanol to acetaldehyde, okay? And because that's a neurotoxin, what do you think your body wants to do with it? Get it out of here. You know how your body can use alcohol as a fuel source, which you can do. I just want to say it's a very good fuel source. And that's why your body wants to deal with it first. Get it out of here, okay? So we can utilize better fuel sources. That's me really dumbing it down. Does that make sense? Okay?
Yeah.
But your body has to convert the alcohol to ethanol to acetaldehyde to acetate, acetic acid, and then it's going to convert it to carbon dioxide, which people would have heard of, okay? So how we're going to get rid of the alcohol, the ethanol, the acetaldehyde, is either breathe it out or sweat it out. So H2O would be the other reason. So we have, my point is that we have these toxins, we have conversion processes for them to clear them out of the body. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. But you can imagine here, okay, now I would say it's all going to come down to, if you have a compromisation of the Paneth cells, one of the roles of the Paneth cells is they actually express, they call it a peptide, but it's really a hormone. So it's made up of 36 amino acids, and that's called the PYY peptide, or peptide YY. Now, its job, so that does actually play a role with things like satiety. So what I'm talking about there is you feeling full, yeah? So it's got other roles as well, not just the role I'm going to talk about now, okay? But one of the key roles of the PYY peptide, but it's really coming down to the Paneth cell structure, okay, is to actually modulate, so it's selectively antifungal. So what is one of its major roles? deal and regulate and modulate the candida and the yeast levels. Even like the panicels, one of their major roles is microbiome homeostasis. So what I mean by that, regulation of the microbiome levels. Where a lot of people perceive that how you help with like microbiome homeostasis is take a probiotic or a prebiotic. Well, a lot of it is coming down to the antimicrobial peptides in the panicels. It's a big point. Yeah, okay. So the PYY peptide being selectively antifungal, what it does, it prevents the commensal forms, which are beneficial, from turning into their more virulent forms where now they're more problematic. Okay, so if you have any compromisation of the panicels or any decrease in the PYY peptide, what are you going to be more prone to? You're going to be more prone to candida and yeast overgrowth. Okay, and this is where this is going to become more problematic. Okay, because now the candida and the yeast is going to release these toxins into your system. Okay, and the two ones that we're going to focus on mainly, okay, is acetaldehyde and ethanol. Okay, and so this is where it becomes a problem. Okay, so with acetaldehyde depletes a lot of micronutrients. Okay, so you actually put a lot of pressure on things like B1, which is thiamine, also B3, that's the one we're going to focus on a little bit more, okay, which is niacin. And you actually need things like B1, you need that for acetylcholine. I talked about that's another neurotransmitter, which actually helps with things like muscle contraction, short-term, long-term memory conversion. So you see how much issues you could have around like the brain and neurological function.
So are there links to dementia and things like that as well with this?
So one thing I am going to talk about is a bit of a link to like Parkinson's disease as well.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So with the acetaldehyde, I'm going to come back to that. Okay. Acetaldehyde, what it does, one, it can compromise the gut lining more. So it actually damages a tight junction protein. It's called a filter protein. It's called occludin. I don't want to spend too much time on that. Okay. It's just another rabbit hole. Okay. But what I mean by a filter protein, it's going to dictate what goes through and what doesn't. So if you damage that, you impact the filtering process. So then things that would normally get filtered at a particular rate, they're passing through the intracellular tight junctions in between epithelium and mucosal cells in your gut lining. And now they're getting into what's called the hepatic portal system, like bloodstream liver. Now your body can deal with small amounts of acetaldehyde, but it really struggles to deal with high amounts of acetaldehyde. And now the acetaldehyde can attach itself to enzymes. It can permeate through those intracellular tight junctions, get into the hepatic portal system. If your body can't really deal with the high amounts of it, now the acetaldehyde can permeate up through your blood-brain barrier. And you see where this is going to start to become a problem, okay, because it's a neurotoxin. Yeah, and so the major thing I want to focus on here, okay, is that the acetaldehyde can overburden the HPA axis, okay, which is hypothalamus, anterior pituitary gland, and adrenals. And that could actually lead to HPA dysfunction. So your stress resilience is decreased. You just can't handle stress that well. Okay. Now, also you can get this overburdening of the hypothalamus. Now, we said the hypothalamus is really important for what? Dopamine. We talked about that. Yeah. So like this really, like acetaldehyde is going to affect 3 of the major areas that are essential for dopamine in the brain. That's my big point. Okay, so this can actually lead to a higher release of stress hormones like CRH being the big one, corticotropin releasing hormone. And then when you've got a high production of that stress hormone, that sends a message to your digestive system to shut down. Okay, and so that could even lead to aspects where you have a fluctuating appetite. Okay, and you downregulate things like enteric hormones, like gut hormones, like ghrelin. Okay, and ghrelin also you need for the secretion of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. So that could affect things like muscle recovery, muscle repair. Okay, and these people can have like little niggles all over the body that never really get better. Once again, that's a different conversation. Yeah, but the other thing with the acetaldehyde, when it permeates up through the blood-brain barrier, it forms other chemical compounds. One of them is called, these are big names, so I can't dumb down these big names anymore, okay? But one is called tetrahydropapaverine. Now, what it, and that's a big name, okay? But that is, when you have high amounts of that, okay, that is basically it has neurotoxic effects to dopamine neurons. Okay, and also affects the biosynthesis of serotonin. So that actually leads to things like social phobias, nervousness, anxiety, and even bouts of depression. Okay, now
Just to jump
yeah,
in, Dave,
yeah.
are there any psychologists uh, or like working in conjunction with gut health experts? Because it sounds like it's,
I'm sure there are, Connor.
yeah,
I don't know them. Yeah.
yeah,
But I don't want to say there's not because I'm sure there is. Yeah. Okay. So I don't, and, you know, I'm sure there's a lot more psychologists and psychiatrists, okay, who are starting to put that connection together. Yeah. Okay. Because like my big thing would be, I just don't think you can correct what's going on in the brain if you don't address what's going on in the gut.
yeah. And
I,
it makes so
I
much sense
yeah.
just to if you're looking at society's general health now, like a lot of people are overweight, a lot of people are not eating proper food. So most likely there's gut dysregulation going on there. And then there's a mental health epidemic going on at the same time. So I guess it's just really important for people to understand like everything's connected. It's not like
You know,
your
like
fitness, your fit.
the one thing I could say for sure. Sorry to interrupt. Yeah, okay.
Uh,
But the one thing I could say for sure, okay, is that gut issues they are getting worse.
mm,
They're not getting better. I can't give you a direct percentage of like how many people are dealing with like candida and yeast issues, and I could tell you like relapse and recurrence statistics, and they're terrible. But that's not
yeah,
giving us an overall picture of how many people are actually dealing with those types of complications. Yeah, okay. But from my perspective, I would imagine that these types of issues are just getting worse. Yeah.
yeah,
Um, Getting back to the acetaldehyde, another thing I wanted to mention that acetaldehyde forms another chemical compound when it permeates up through the blood-brain barrier. And this one's a little bit easier to pronounce here. Okay, it's called salsolinol. Now, salsolinol, when you have high amounts of that, that causes you to burn out your dopamine-producing cells. So more issues around dopamine, yeah, okay? And this can actually impact even a part of the brain called the substantia nigra. Now, what did I say right at the start? Okay, a part of the brain that's really important for dopamine is the substantia nigra as well. So you're also impacting that region as well. Now, high amounts of salsolinol, if you burn out your dopamine producing cells. Now, one thing I want to clear up, perception is if you have low dopamine, people think like lack of motivation, lack of get up and go, don't they? Yeah, okay. I would say the number one symptom of low dopamine is lack of energy.
mm,
People are just extremely flatline. I just want to clear that up. Yeah, okay. We could go into what would be the major symptoms if someone's got low dopamine. Okay. Well, I'd say generally it's probably going to be anxiety and lack of energy, fatigue and lethargy and mood changes, and but they tend to have higher.
depression as well,
Uh,
low
Yes. Okay. Well,
energy.
definitely low dopamine can cause depressive like behavior for sure. Okay.
Yeah.
But they you could say like low dopamine, really high addiction profiles, and the addiction profile is going to be even worse. Okay. Do you know why? Because they've got a lack of energy and they're reliant on external factors to pick up their energy for them.
Oh, so you mean like
So it could be coffee or caffeine, it could
caffeine
be sugar, it could
or
be sex, it could be training, it
yeah.
could be money, it could be gambling, it could be power, it could be. But I would
Mm,
say that their addiction profiles are going to be even more exacerbated. Does that make sense? Okay. And even like sleep disturbances and insomnia. Okay. Now, if someone was more, um, even if you look at the health complications that have been linked to like, dopamine issues. Okay. Well, we're talking about schizophrenia and there's a link there. Okay. But even things like Tourette's and Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease and autism and ADHD and addiction, I'm going to say there's moving bits within those as well. Okay, I'm not one of those people who just go, it's just a dopamine issue.
yep.
Because it's also like gut related and there's bacterial issues and all that type of stuff that would be linked to these things as well. Okay. But if someone you can have high dopamine symptoms as well. And what did we say with like schizophrenia? There could be a link there with higher dopamine, but also lower dopamine. Okay. And you would say like people with higher dopamine symptoms, okay, like eating disorders, there can be a bit of a link there. Okay. Even like self
Would
harm.
higher dopamine be like kind of more manic, like go like really elevated
I
energy?
would say quite a unique characteristic, okay, with people with like higher dopamine is do you know what like higher reinforcement profiles are?
No.
Validation. Okay, and so that would generally show up with what? Well, could be like working too hard because that's one way you receive validation. Okay, another one could be sport, athletic performance because that's another way. I'm a little bit old school. You might be old school as well. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
where you generally receive that validation from working too hard or like sport. Okay, but the
Yeah.
new one nowadays is social media because you can receive that validation at the drop of a hat. Okay,
Yeah, interesting.
yeah, okay. And then addiction profiles are still going to be an issue with like high dopamine as well. But even like I think like self injury and self harm have actually been linked to like dopamine, high dopamine issues as well. Yeah, okay. But um, I know I'm talking about like a lot of different things here. Okay, but even like so that's to do with like the acetaldehyde. Okay,
Yep.
and acetaldehyde you can get from many things. I want to say that as well. Yeah, okay. Some of the major ones would be like yeast and candida and yeast fermentation, some parasitic infection, and that's another topic we're going to talk about. Okay, can exacerbate acetaldehyde issues. Okay, so we are going to talk about protozoa parasites or protozoan parasites. One in particular that has definitely been linked to like schizophrenia. That is pretty. The information around that is pretty clear. Yeah. Okay.
So
Um,
we've gone on, we're talking about Candida
we're
and
going to
yeast
stay with the
now.
candida and the yeast
Yeah.
at the moment,
Okay.
okay? But we
Cool.
are going to move to like a protozoa parasite,
Yep.
which is called toxoplasmosis or Toxoplasma gondii, yeah, okay?
One
So
thing, Dave, the people with the gut health research have really made it very user friendly with the with the names.
I
They're
know,
like,
like I can't.
let's make sure that people just never understand this
Well,
stuff.
exactly, yeah.
Needs
So,
rebranding.
but other things can exacerbate acetaldehyde as well. So you get acetaldehyde from alcohol.
Hmm.
Yeah, okay. You get it from cigarette smoke. Okay, you can get it from the fermentation of certain types of foods. You can get it from like even dairy. You can get it from, do I say car exhaust fumes? You can get it from that. Yeah, okay. So there's other things that ripened fruits. That's not me saying fruit is bad, by the way. Okay, but you can even get that from, you can get acetaldehyde from ripened fruits as well. So there's many things that might potentially exacerbate the acetaldehyde issues. Okay, but obviously, one of the big ones, okay, would be candida and yeast. Okay, the other thing that you actually get from candida and yeast. So remember, I said that ethanol gets converted to acetaldehyde. Well, ethanol you definitely get from candida and yeast. Yeah, okay. They've actually shown that in research. Okay, they actually showed a particular strain called Candida albicans. Okay, was able to produce ethanol, and that was actually shown in like human blood stored, okay, at room temperature. They showed that, okay. So, and then with ethanol, they've done research around that. So this would apply to alcohol as well, yeah. That ethanol actually impacts a part of the brain called the VTA. Now I said another part of the brain that you produce dopamine is the VTA. It's called the ventral tegmental area of the brain. And so this actually, the ethanol increases like an excitatory response in the VTA. Okay. So, and they even did like, that was actually shown. Okay. So these neurons, okay, were impacted by acute like ethanol administration. Okay. So my point is, okay, if the ethanol, which you could get from alcohol as well, interesting enough, a lot of people with like candida and yeast, they tend to have alcohol sensitivity. And you know
Mm.
why? Because they're already getting high amounts of ethanol and acetaldehyde coming from the candida and the yeast. So they've got alcohol sensitivity. So these would be the people that when they have a couple of drinks, they go, I already feel, because they already feel little bit drunk. Does that make sense?
Hmm.
And when they have alcohol, they go just, I feel out of it. Okay, even when they might just have a couple of drinks, wake up the next day and they go, can't really remember anything.
Oh, wow.
Because they've
Interesting.
already got the acetal and the ethanol coming from the candida and the yeast. Okay, but this overstimulation of the VTA leads to a spontaneous release of dopamine. So you would say in that instance, there's a bit higher amount of dopamine. Does that make sense?
Hmm.
So you might have some more of those symptoms that were related to high dopamine. But with this high release of dopamine, spontaneous release of dopamine, that actually leads to higher reinforcement profiles and higher validation profiles.
Can you explain
And,
that?
well, once again, okay, how's that going to show up? It's not because everyone, when I say candida and yeast to people, most people's perception is, oh, I'm going to get digestive symptoms,
Hmm.
or I'm going to get like, maybe white coating on the tongue, or
Yeah.
fungal toe infection, or tinea, and I'm not saying you can't get those things, but when you're getting those things, the candida and the yeast overgrowth is pretty bad. Most
Mm,
of the time, how it's going to show up, the most common symptoms are what I'm talking about now, neurological.
yeah.
They're behavioral disorders. Does that make sense? Okay. So I wanna go into the link with like schizophrenia, yeah, okay, or where the potential link is here, yeah, okay. So to so acetaldehyde. Remember I said that your body wants to clear that out of the body, yeah, okay. So the acetaldehyde has to get converted to acetate acetic acid, and then it gets converted to the carbon dioxide H2O. To convert the acetaldehyde to acetate or acetic acid, it needs certain compounds. So one of the compounds is glutathione. That's the master antioxidant in the body. So you put a little bit more pressure on that. Okay. Another compound is you need an enzyme. It's called aldehyde dehydrogenase. Now, from my experience, that doesn't tend to be a big problem. Okay. But another compound that you need, okay, is NAD. Some people might have heard of NAD. You can take that as a supplement. Okay.
Hmm.
But NAD is a coenzyme. So what I mean by that, Connor, it's a helper molecule. That's what it is. But it plays a key role in your mitochondria and your cells. Yeah. Okay. So I'm talking about energy here. Yeah.
Hmm.
And the way to understand it, NAD is a derivative from niacin. So what you need for NAD, you need niacin. And so niacin, which is vitamin B3, niacin is a tranquilizer for the brain. So it actually helps around things like ADHD, obsessive compulsive disorder, antisocial behavioral disorder, addiction, schizophrenia, psychosis, bipolar. You see what I'm getting at here, okay? And so what you're doing is you're putting a lot more pressure on that B3. But you understand you need B3 for other mechanisms within the body as well, okay? You need B3 for glucose and carbohydrate metabolization and fat metabolization. But the priority is going to be using the niacin, okay? I'm not going to bore people to tears with like the conversion processes and all that type of stuff,
No.
yeah, okay? But you need the niacin for the NAD. Okay, that's really important. But that you understand that the NAD is going to be prioritized and the niacin is going to be prioritized for the acetaldehyde. Do you understand why? Because it's a neurotoxin. It's going to damage your brain cells. Okay, and that even means things like glucose and carbohydrate metabolization and fat metabolization can come to a bit of a slow grind. That's not me saying it doesn't happen. Okay, but how could that show up? That could actually show up with energy issues where the
Mm.
person just feels flat and tired. Okay, now one more thing, because I know you want to ask me a question. Okay, but there's a recycling process for like NAD. Okay, but if you have too much acetaldehyde, okay, the recycling of NAD. So NAD gets converted to a thing called NADH. I'm going to try and restrain myself here. Okay, NADH. The H stands for hydrogen. Okay. All right. And if you even look at like NAD, it actually helps with things like mental clarity and alertness and concentration and memory and helps even around things like chronic fatigue and all that type of stuff. Okay. But the NADH gets recycled back to NAD. That's what should happen. But the way to look at it is the recycling of NAD is impeded on by acetaldehyde. So when you have too much acetaldehyde coming from the yeast and the candida, which is what we're talking about, okay, that is going to impede on that. Does that make sense? Okay. And so that basically means that the NADH can accumulate. I'm trying to dumb this down as much as I can, okay?
Hmm.
But when the NADH accumulates, okay, that can actually, so too much NADH creates things like fearfulness, insomnia, inability to concentrate, worrying, headaches. Now, all these things that I'm talking about, what are they? They're neurological problems.
Mm.
Does that make sense? Okay, and even going right back to like what we talked about with like the niacin, yeah, okay. Um, Remember I said, yeah, okay, that niacin deficiency could actually be linked to schizophrenic symptoms.
Hmm.
You see the connection here. Now that's not me saying that this is the sole cause. Yeah, okay. It's me saying that it could be even if like so you would say that what's going on with the candida and the yeast could be similar to when you're actually having like alcohol consumption. I always bring up this example with people, okay? Like if you go to an area in your city or where you live, okay, where there's got high amounts of alcoholics, yeah? And there's also a bit of a link here, okay? We actually do know that people who drink alcohol, okay, that they are more prone to candida and yeast. And then when you abstain from alcohol, that the intestinal abundance of the candida actually decreases. So they actually showed in individuals with alcohol use disorder, okay, they were actually, so when they abstain from alcohol, they're actually shown to have lower levels, okay, of abundance of candida. They actually checked that in what's called Candida albicans IgG, which is like an antibody immunoglobulin. So they had lower serum anti-candida albican IgG levels after they abstained from the alcohol. So my point is that the acetaldehyde can create issues around what? Addiction.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so then that creates more issues around the alcohol. Okay. And then the alcohol can be linked to more intestinal abundance with the candida and the yeast. So if I go to an area where there's a lot of alcoholics, what's one thing you notice? Well, there'd be people like walking down the street, they're talking to themselves.
Yeah.
Which is like schizophrenic symptoms.
That's the one thing, like,
Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, because it's the niacin issue that it's actually affecting them. Is that what you're saying?
They even like they showed, they actually, there was some research, yeah, okay, where they actually showed the development of like psychotic symptoms, okay, following just even a small ingestion of small quantities of alcohol. So
And
that
then,
you
sorry,
see
go
what I'm
on.
saying? Okay, so my point is, remember, alcohol gets converted to ethanol to acetaldehyde, but we only think like the only issue is going to be the alcohol. But you can also get the ethanol and the acetaldehyde from candida and yeast. That's my point.
And
Which
then they're
means
coming.
it could actually show, it could display with similar symptoms. That's my point. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to touch on, which is really scary. In that, and like this could have happened to my mother as well. I'm not sure. Like she was diagnosed with schizophrenia, but the impact of like labeling is so powerful as well. So just like as an example, it's a niacin issue. It's not actually like schizophrenia, but you have the symptoms, you go to a psychiatrist, they're like, you're a schizophrenic. All of a sudden that's that nocibic language, like your whole belief now is like that you're kind of broken essentially. And then you're just stuck in that state kind of forever, which is pretty heartbreaking because it could be just a niacin issue that could be solved.
Yeah. Well, like even if like, you know what I'm talking about, like, so for example, like just trying to like break down the acetaldehyde, okay. So even like some of the enzymes that you're using to break it down, yeah, okay. So there's one called aldehyde oxidase, but you always need micronutrients to help with that. So for example, you need like riboflavin, you might have heard of that, like vitamin B2, yeah, okay. You also need iron. You need molybdenum, okay, which is a trace mineral, okay. So you need like these other cofactors. I've already talked about like important ones like, you know, B3 and zinc, and so, but my point is, okay, is that you're putting more pressure on them. So then I'm putting more pressure on molybdenum. Well, I need molybdenum for other things as well. Okay, it's needed for like, because like it's actually needed for an enzyme that breaks down like uric acid, for example. So then that could potentially lead to like crystallization and lead to something like gout.
hmm.
So I'm not saying that that is the culprit behind it, but you see how it leads to other problems. It's like a domino effect, isn't it?
Yeah.
Mm.
And then each individual will express it depending on their individual, um, whatever their
Yeah, well, because
psychology.
yeah, well, because once again, okay, there can be all these other underlying factors that are, you know, at play as well.
Yeah.
Okay, that's why, you know, what with what I do, yeah, okay, I'm looking at like, like it's unlikely, like we're talking about candida and yeast, yeah, okay, but it's unlikely that someone just has the one bacterial complication or the one pathogen. So most of the time, people have like co-infection, they have multi-layered bacterial issues. So, for example, we're talking about, we'll make it relevant to candida and yeast because we're talking about it. But if you had
Hmm.
something like H. pylori, you might have heard of that before, Helicobacter,
Yeah.
okay,
It's
which affects the acidifying effects of hydrochloric acid. So then you have stomach acid issues. Yeah, okay. But H.
and
pylori is not.
just for people, that's like a parasite.
It's a negative gram bacteria. Negative gram
Okay.
bacteria refers to, it has two cell membranes, and the outer membrane is like LPS, lipopolysaccharides. I won't go too far down that rabbit hole, okay? But it's not the devil either. So it's parvonormocology in the stomach lining, but then you can have a ratio issue. Connor, does that make sense? You have too much of it, and that's where it becomes
Yep.
problematic, okay? But if you have like H. pylori, Helicobacter, and then you have Candida and yeast, this is how smart bacteria is, okay? Well, the H. pylori can actually enter the yeast cell, and when it enters the yeast cell, so a lot of the time, what they're going to use to try and treat the H. pylori, the Helicobacter, is antibiotics. Okay, like amoxicillin, clindamycin, maybe protein pump inhibitors. But you understand that antibiotics are not going to work against what? Yeast and candida. Because to deal with yeast and candida, you would need antifungals like nystatin. So they're using the antibiotics, but then the H. pylori is in the yeast cell, and you see how the antibiotics, so it gives the H. pylori the ability to evade and inhibit the immune response.
Hmm.
My point around that, okay, that's why you also have to deal with the other underlying complications. Because a lot of time we just think it's like it's just going to be one thing that we have to deal with.
Yeah.
But it's the environment. That's what we have to fix. Okay, it's not just targeting like one thing and we're just going to deal with that one thing. It's going to rectify everything. Does that make sense?
Let's go to
Let's go to the next one.
toxoplasmosis.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is a really fascinating one. Yeah. Okay. And so this is a parasite. I mentioned it briefly. Okay. So it's called toxoplasmosis. It's Toxoplasma gondii infection. Now, if you do a bit of, hopefully, I want people to go away and maybe research it themselves. And it's really interesting because toxoplasmosis potentially, there's different stats on this. One thing I want to communicate, but that might actually affect anywhere between 30 to 50% of the world population. So this gets really scary. Yeah. Okay. Now I've looked at some information where they say that in terms of people just having Toxoplasma gondii infection, because I'll get back to the more common scenario that is going to be maybe even a little bit more problematic. Okay, in relation to people, I found some stuff where they say Toxoplasma gondii can infect anywhere between 10 to 80% of inhabitants in the world.
Are there symptoms specifically to know if
Well,
you
okay,
have it,
so
or
so so if you look up Dr. Google Wikipedia, which I don't advise people to do, okay, because you're gonna look it up and they're gonna say, well, the major way that you get it's a one-celled organism, okay, it's a protozoa parasite or a protozoan parasite. So other ones that are protozoa parasites are like blasto. Maybe you might have heard of that in the past, like
I
Blastocyst
had
zonus.
that.
Yeah,
I
okay.
had that.
Dentamoeba fragilis, Gardia lambia, okay. And I would say parasites get a bit of a bad rap because some parasites I actually think you can live in harmony with. So I don't want to demonize them. Toxoplasma gondii is one of those ones where I think you can't really live in harmony with it. So it can reside in your vital organs, okay. And if you've got a really good immune system, it's not going to completely run havoc, or it's not going to be that as detrimental. But we'll sort of come back to that because once again, is avoidance the answer? Is because there's a good chance you are going to get it.
Hmm.
Because if you look it up, okay, they say the major ways you're going to get it is like cat feces or dog feces, or you can even get it from soil. You can get it from contaminated meat, contaminated water. Now, what we're led to believe is that, okay, have you seen like even mainstream media articles where they're saying there's a link between cat ownership and schizophrenia? I've actually seen articles actually talking about that
Oh.
because what they're talking about is Toxoplasma gondii. Now, people are going to read that, and what do you think they're going to do? I'm going to get rid of my cat, or I'm going to kill my cat. Yeah, okay. But yeah, do we really think that's the answer? Avoidance is the answer. Avoidance is not the answer. You can't live your life like Bubble Boy.
Yep.
Yeah, because even if you don't own a cat, someone's got a cat. They handle the cat feces, then they handle your food. Okay, or maybe someone was gardening, so you get like it's like oral transmission. They've been doing gardening. They put their hands close to their mouth. They get the transmission. Just another way. Does that make sense? So
And
how?
also just avoidance anyways, like you get less resilient overall with a lot of stuff.
Exactly. Where you know what I'm going to say, okay, really the answer is to prepare the area that is going to interact with it. And surprise, surprise, the area that is going to hold you in good stead if you get toxoplasmosis is going to be the Panner cells again.
Hmm.
We are going to come back to that, okay? And that's what I would say to people: prepare the area that interacts with it, because there is a relatively good chance that you are going to come into contact with it.
And
Now, the
to just
most
zoom out more, it's like prepare the panels, but just help your gut health in general.
Yeah, so I'll talk about
Yeah.
like I'll try and give like simple things that people can put in
Yeah.
place to actually help with that. I mean, obviously there can be a lot of technicalities to that as
Yeah.
well, okay, but I'll try and give really simple things that people could focus on. You know, supplements, I'm always big on supplements, as you know, but then
Hmm.
sometimes, yes, supplements might be necessary, but we can keep that really simple as well. Yeah.
Yep. Let's
But the
talk
thing is,
about the impact with schizophrenia
yeah,
with
so one thing I wanted to talk
toxo.
about, yeah, okay, is just that the most, one of the most common forms, okay, so what they talk about with Toxoplasma gondii is that it can be active or non-active. And so the perception, okay, would be if it's like, it's latent basically means asymptomatic. So you know what I mean by that? Okay, you don't actually experience any symptoms from it. So
Yep.
the most common, when they say anywhere between about 30 to 70% of the world population actually have latent toxoplasmosis. So guess what, Connor? They don't even know they've got it. And so perception is going to be what? Well, if I don't know I've got it, it's not really causing any issues.
Hmm.
But everything I'm going to talk about now, this is linked to latent toxoplasmosis. This is linked to asymptomatic.
Hmm.
So when you don't even know you've got it. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So there's actually some research. People can fact check me around this. Okay. They actually did, this is quite large. Okay. They actually did it on 6,367 like individuals. So this, we're talking about pretty decent research. And that was actually done on individuals with latent toxoplasmosis. So once again, being asymptomatic, okay, and they were actually looking at typical mental health symptoms and disorders that were actually linked to it. These were some of the disorders. Autism was actually a big one. Schizophrenia, that's actually quite huge. Yeah, okay. Anxiety, autism, attention deficit disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, antisocial behavioral disorder, learning disabilities, anxiety, and you can find there's plenty of literature around this, and even toxoplasmosis was actually linked to associated with elevated like biomarkers of inflammation. So it was more inflammation as well. There's a couple of parts of the brain. So toxoplasmosis is actually linked to even like cysts in the brain.
Well,
So there's obviously a decent amount of damage to the brain here. Parts of the brain that Toxoplasma gondii could actually really negatively impact. You've heard of the hippocampus before? Okay.
yep.
Well, the hippocampus, that is neuroplasticity, that's grey matter. That's emotional regulation. That's short-term memory. That's long-term memory. That's short-term and long-term memory conversion. And the other part of the brain is the amygdala as well. So we're talking about essential parts of the brain. And do you know, so those two parts of the brain, do you know what neurological conditions are linked to abnormalities in those two parts of the brain?
No.
Schizophrenia,
Wow.
Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, depression.
So you could have, let's just say, 10 people all with this deficiency or this issue with toxoplasmosis, and they're just expressing, one person expresses it as schizophrenia, one as autism, one as bipolar, one as so on and so forth.
Well, I think this is really important, okay, where they actually looked at, this was a bit of an overview of like a lot of the studies. Yeah, okay. So they actually out of like they had like 19 studies that were actually done on Toxoplasma gondii. Okay.
Do you know
Um,
where this was based, Dave? Like the
uh,
studies,
you,
what
you,
population?
yeah, I'm pretty good at like I'm obviously memory is one of my strong points. Okay. But I can't remember like all the ins and outs of the. I
Yeah.
wish I actually had it open in front of me and I could just quote it. Yeah. Okay. But
Yeah, no problem.
um, I'm racking my. I look. I probably can't remember. Yeah. Okay. But
Hmm.
they actually looked at 19 studies that were actually done on Toxoplasma gondii infection in individuals with schizophrenia and even like other psychiatric disorders. Okay. So 18 reported a high percentage. I think it was 18. Yeah. Okay. They reported high percentage of Toxoplasma antibodies. okay, in the affected individuals. 11 of the studies, okay, what was it? 11 of the studies, 11 of those studies, the statistics were, what was, oh, I lost my chain of thought. Yeah, okay, I think it was like 11 of the studies, the differences were statistically significant.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, it's getting like, that's not me saying definitive, but there's definitely a link there. That's my point. Yeah, there's definitely a link there.
What did they say? Like in general, and obviously you don't like every out of the 19, but in general, was there like, okay, based on this, research or so on and so forth, like this is what we
They, they,
recommend,
they,
or did
they
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 say
showed
anything?
they showed a pretty there was a clear sort of link there.
Did they give
Okay,
any
even if
advice
like well even did they give advice?
on like, you know, based on this, if you have these elevated levels, or you should get tested if you have a family history or anything like
No,
that?
no. I mean, obviously they're just talking about the connection and the links, and saying that
Mm,
there was a statistically significant link there. But a lot of the time they're not giving you remedies within it, okay, to what to do around the toxoplasma gondii or, unfortunately. I mean, I'm going to say some things that can be quite beneficial, okay,
yeah.
and I'm going to try and keep them as simple as possible. But even though you made me actually think of a research where they looked at toxoplasma gondii infection in the early stages of like pregnancy. Yeah, okay. Because obviously a female can actually get the protozoal parasite when they're pregnant, okay, and that was associated with like neuro developmental disorders, and that was
With
actually
the child.
with a child, so it was a risk factor for autism actually.
Wow. That's very interesting as well, because of like I don't know what the increase, but it seems like autism is much more prevalent now than it has been.
Yeah, well, and it didn't even stop there because even like there was links with like toxoplasma gondii infection was associated with like male reproductive impairments, so that was shown in actually like human and animal studies. So that's
Mm,
basically means that it's going to be really bad around testosterone.
yeah.
So
Let's talk.
there was even hormonal imbalances there, and that was actually shown for like both men and women. Both
So
men and women had lower serum testosterone concentrations, but I don't want to go down the testosterone route.
So we
Yeah.
we focused on a lot of the. I think if we just stop now, it would be very kind of depressing. Like we're just kind of we're kind of screwed. Let's go into like, okay, like someone's listening, they're like, all right, all of this stuff is pretty scary.
Mm.
What can I do to put myself in a better position?
Okay, so one thing I talked about was the importance of Panacels. Yeah, okay, so once again, I am going to quote a bit of research here. It sounds depressing, but there's going to be a positive spin on the end. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
But they actually showed they did this in mice. Okay, but they actually showed a lack of autophagy. Do you want me to explain? Like like autophagy
Yep.
is like the body's cellular repair system, basically. Yeah, okay. We're talking about cell cycling. So they actually showed that a lack of autophagy uh, in Panacels, okay, and then the mice would actually have toxoplasma gondii infection, okay, that increases sensitivity to pro-inflammatory cytokines like TNF alpha. It also increased intestinal permeability, so it was more damage to the gut lining. A deficiency, okay, in autophagy in the Panacels resulted in inability to control inflammation. So the inflammation was worse, okay, and that even resulted in acute mortality. So mortality means death. Okay, so what does this tell us? This tells us that the Panacels are really important when it comes to if you get exposed to toxoplasma gondii infection. So preparation around the Panacels is really important. Well, one clear bit of information. We know that compromised Panacels will occur if someone is on a typical Western diet. So where 40% of their breakdown is coming from things like hydrogenated fats and trans fats and seed oils and vegetable oils and refined sugars and sugars. That's only 40%, Connor. So
Hmm.
when people being on that for 20, 30 years, and then they try to switch the nutritional outline to a healthier nutritional outline, was not enough to rectify the compromised Panacels.
Yep.
So eat cleaner would be a big thing, yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
like lifestyle factors. We know that sleep deprivation, short sleep time frames, compromise your cells, higher like antibiotic usage, NSAIDs, ibuprofen. Now, that's
Mhm.
not me saying there's not a time and a place for antibiotics. I want to make that clear, okay? But an overusage, like being reliant on these things, is not good for your cells, okay? Like acetaldehyde, ethanol. Guess what? Ironically, those things are not good for your cells. So even if you've got candida and yeast, the acetal and the ethanol coming from the candida and the yeast compromises the cells. But guess what? It's the cells and the PYY peptide that modulate and regulate your candida levels. It's ironic. Everything's like a loop in the body. Does that make sense? So,
Yeah.
alcohol consumption is not good for two major epithelium in the gut lining. So one is the natural defense mechanism, and the other one, which is called ISCs, intestinal stem cells, that is your natural replenishment and rejuvenation process within the gut lining.
Hmm.
So alcohol consumption, yeah, like we
So
know that alcohol creates long-term damage in the gut lining. We know that, yeah. So this
alcohol, sleep, diet. When you say diet, like meat, vegetables, low refined food, just
Yeah,
to make
I'd
it
say
really
like
easy.
yeah, just keep it clean. Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. You know, a lot of the building blocks that you need for the gut lining, because once again, what I'm talking about here, these epithelium, they're just connective tissue. So if we look like a particular layer of the gut lining called the mucosa, and in that you've got Golgi, which is gut-associated lymphoid tissue, where 70% of your entire immune system is located. What building blocks do you need for that? You need amino acids like methionine, like threonine, like glutamate, glutamine, cysteine. Well, where do you get a lot of these amino acids from? You get them from animal proteins, good quality animal proteins. I'm big on animal fats. Okay. You need things like to actually help with type 1 collagen. The gut line is predominantly type 1 and type 3 collagen. For type 1 collagen, outside of those, some of the like hydroxyproline, proline, glycine, arginine, glutamine, that's why slow cooked meats, bone broth,
Mm.
bone marrow, gelatin. Okay, then you need vitamin C, good quality, like things like guava, bell peppers, capsicum, um, golden kiwi fruit, super high in. We know that even the vitamin C is so high in golden kiwi fruit and kiwi fruit that can even boost up your neutrophils, which is like a white blood cell. It's an immune cell.
Mhm.
So good quality vitamin C, things that like B6. Things like scallops really high in B6. Yeah. You know,
So like
uh,
just nutrition, we've got the sleep, minimizing alcohol or eliminating it if you can. I haven't drank in 2 years actually. It's like it's
yeah.
actually very easy,
I
surprisingly.
know. I think you know my story as well. Like I used to party pretty hard. I'm really vocal about that. I mean, I lived in London for 10 years. I think that says it all. Yeah. Okay. So,
Yeah.
uh, so I pushed. I burnt the candle at both ends.
Yeah.
So I empathize with people because I've been there myself. Yeah. And I stepped away from alcohol, and I'm not saying it's the sole reason to how I was able to rectify my gut issues, and but it definitely helped. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
Um, Anything else? Like the thing I love about it is like these are all the problems: nutrition, sleep, alcohol. What about training?
Trainees, that's becoming a really interesting conversation. Yeah, okay, because like I would say anything for me when you've got these types of issues, when you got underlying gut issues, okay, what you want to do is you want to try and minimize central fatigue.
Yeah.
So things that would contribute to central fatigue would be low grade inflammation, acute inflammation, dysbiosis, like your gut issues. But also, I would say probably some people they're not going to like this, okay, but higher volume. Um, you know, slow eccentrics, slow eccentrics with higher volume. Okay, so that would be maybe more accumulation, more volume. That
What about
they
a lot of people, Dave, talk about like a lot of the researchers, like the benefits of HIIT training. What are
I
your
don't,
thoughts there?
me personally, okay, when you've got underlying gut issues, working like lactate threshold, like energy system work, like aerobic power, lactate capacity, that is going to be more problematic. Especially when you've got underlying bacterial issues where one of the byproducts from bacteria is lactic acid. So yes, you've got L-lactate, but you get D-lactate, especially when you've got something like SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. That's probably a conversation for another time.
I
But you can
do
have a
have,
thing called
yeah.
D-lactate acidosis, where you have like ataxia, like slurred speech, you have coordination issues, motor skill issues. These are all neurological problems, neurotoxicity, spatial awareness issues. So that D-lactate acidosis is very similar to like symptoms like ALS, like motor neurons, which
Mhm.
obviously there's different types of motor neurons like bulbar, but we definitely know there's a link to like bacterial complications and something like motor neurons like ALS. But I don't want to
What, yeah,
go too
what
far
would
down
be
that
like
rabbit
just
hole.
like
Well,
a
I would say
safe option for
if the, if
like just
yeah, if the goal is, let's say the person has the goal like they want to, because building a little bit more muscle is really important. Okay, and I would say if the goal is a bit more hypertrophy, I would look at training systems that minimize the central fatigue, where keep your rep range. The highest on your rep range might be about 8 reps.
yeah.
Yeah, okay. Now also like you can go back to like old school bodybuilders who really their primary goal was more health related. This
Hmm.
is before the introduction of like anabolics and steroids, okay? Because now a lot of the templates that people are using are really based on people who are using, PEDs, performance enhancing drugs,
Yeah.
where they're going to get more of a support from a neurology perspective. Yeah, okay. So they got the support around the central nervous system, okay, even aspects around glycogen stores. Okay, they're able to build muscle in areas that don't normally get that muscle growth. There's
Yeah.
aspects around slow twitch muscle fibers, converting the slow twitch muscle fibers into fast twitch muscle fibers. We can't, people, natural lifters can't base their training on people who are taking anabolics and taking steroids. So we have to go back and look at this. Is going to sound really old, but look at the old school natural bodybuilders who were actually using like full body routines. They were doing that 3 times a week. They were even
Yeah.
doing like one set configuration, one set systems. Okay. These are the people we're going to look at because they didn't have the support of anabolics and steroids. It's just, look at like Reg Park. If the goal is more strength and hypertrophy, and on top of that, I'm really big on strongman training, which is
Hmm.
actually still, it's really good for like testosterone and growth hormone. You're probably not the best training for hypertrophy itself, okay. But at least with strongman training, you minimize eccentric loading. You minimize the amount of deceleration, acceleration forces.
And
And
it's pretty functional as well.
yeah,
Like you're
so things like
lifting
backward
stuff.
drags and frontward drags
Yeah.
and farmers carries. Okay, and the other one, and I know you're going to like this. Okay, I think gymnastics and calisthenics. Okay,
Mm.
is also a relatively good way of minimizing that central fatigue as well. Okay,
Yeah.
maybe it could be a different conversation around like how much volume do you need around that. I think even people in the gymnastics and the calisthenics realms can probably go
Yeah.
overboard with the amount of volume. Okay, and I'm sure you might agree with me on that one. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. It's just, I think what you touched on there was really the big nugget is like just look at what's worked forever, like how people have been eating and moving and training. And like you've given so much information here, but like if you really zoom out, it's like sleep, food that your great grandparents were eating or grandparents were eating and workout routines that make you feel better, that you can actually sustain over the long term, and not just some random bodybuilding routine that some 3-time Olympia guy is doing with, you know, a pharmaceutical
And
chemist
look,
on his
yeah,
back.
and look at people like like these old school bodybuilders like Clarence Ross and Reg Park, and they were eating really simple. They would have things like raw milk and like raw milk being really high in like TAAs, total antioxidants, and they were having like good quality meat and fish, and like things were just really simple, and they were
Yeah.
really doing it more for health reasons. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome, mate. Well, look, that was a serious masterclass, my man. But I like the way
Can
you,
I just
yeah,
mention like two more
yeah,
things, yeah, okay? Because
yeah,
you know me, I love my supplements. I just want to
yeah,
mention like two supplements
Yep.
that could be really beneficial around like the mental health symptoms, okay, but also digestive. So one that's really interesting around Toxoplasma gondii is berberine. Some people might have heard of that
Mhm.
before, okay. Berberine, it does actually have benefits around like blood sugar management regulation as well. It's like nature's metformin, which is like a type 2 diabetic drug. So it actually helps with the GLUT4 transporter, so it transports glucose in the cell for energy. But berberine was actually shown to help with memory disturbances that were actually induced by Toxoplasma gondii. Okay, and the other one that's pretty interesting, and this may be one for guys that probably a lot of guys are going to like. Okay, you can actually find some good stuff around Tonkat Ali. Yeah, okay. Now I was never always big on Tonkat Ali. Okay, but
How did you
uh,
spell it, Dave?
Tonkat Ali, so
Mm.
Tongcat space and then Ali. Um,
All right.
and so that actually does have some antimicrobial agent, like broad spectrum, where it's actually been shown to help around like pathogenic strains of positive gram bacteria and pathogenic strains of negative gram bacteria, fungal, which obviously we are talking about, okay? But also some antiparasitic benefits, and the major one being toxoplasmosis, Toxoplasma gondii. And just the last thing, okay, is that lysozyme, okay? It's an enzyme. Lysozyme is actually one of the best compounds. They actually showed an oral administration of lysozyme was shown to restore the intestinal microbiome, so it rebalanced it. It also actually helped to restore the composition of the lung microbiome. Not only that, it actually minimized bacterial translocation from the gut lining to other organs in the body, and we sort of spoke about that. But lysozyme supplementation restores Pan's cell function.
Hmm.
In every rat
Okay.
and mice model, they always use lysozyme to restore the Pan's cell function and to actually help with Pan's cell recovery. And even by taking the lysozyme, you actually help because lysozyme we secrete from Pan's cells. And that lysozyme is your natural defense mechanism against fungi and viruses and breaking down the bacterial cell wall and breaking down the biofilm. But everything's a loop, yeah? Okay,
Hmm.
so if you have the compromisation of the Pan's cells, and they've shown this in a lot of literature, one of the first antimicrobial peptides that gets negatively impacted, ironically, is lysozyme. By
Hmm.
taking the oral lysozyme, you actually help to restore the natural levels of the lysozyme from the Pan's cell, and that's a loop. And that doesn't have to be that complicated. You can just take lysozyme as a supplement. There's a company called Biodesign in unfortunately, like US is one of the few places that you can get it, but they do
Hmm.
a lysozyme. It's a decent amount as well. Okay, but it's got some other compounds in there like bromelain and also what's the other one in there? I think it might have a little bit of papain as well, which you get from like papaya. Yeah, okay. So
Got it.
it's got some other enzymes in
Okay.
there, but that's like a really simple tip to actually help with like restoration and recovery of the Pan's cells within the gut lining. Yeah,
Nice, man. Okay. Berberine, Kamkadali, and lysozyme as your three supplement recommendations as well.
yeah. That's me keeping it
Good man.
simple because I might actually recommend some other
Yeah,
ones on top
yeah.
of that. Yeah, okay. Even curcumin's pretty great. Increases AMPs, antimicrobial peptides.
Great, man.
Yeah.
Okay, well, Dave, look, really appreciate your knowledge. It's just always blown away every time I talk to you. Where again is it Instagram the best place for people to look
Instagram at
more?
the moment. Yeah, okay. I'm sure you might provide a bit of a
Yeah,
link. Yeah, okay.
I will, yeah.
And to my website as well. But yeah, I generally say Instagram is probably one of the best ways that people can just support the content that I'm putting out, okay? Or if they want to actually reach out to me, ask me some
Yeah.
direct questions. Yeah,
Yeah, Dave provides like I'll put all the links, but yeah, he does like online consultations and everything as well. So if you're interested in doing more, yeah, you'll find all the links
mentoring,
through what we're doing.
education. Yep, yep,
Yeah.
yep.
Awesome, my man. Really appreciate it.